Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper and analyze the various different articles relevant for the examination, be it for the prelims as well as the mains. And at the same time, we shall also be taking up sample questions and try to understand how to create an answer and how to go about for answer writing in case you are a beginner or you have just initiated your preparation. Now, a PDF of the entire session shall be available on the Telegram link, which you can download after the session is conducted and is held, and thereby use it for your revision. What to revise and how to revise, that is something that we will mention as we go ahead in our discussion along the way. Now, today in total, we are going to have a discussion for 10 different topics on varying lengths, some relevant for the prelims and some of them relevant for the mains examination. So, overall, the six topics that you see here listed above, that is something where we will encompass a greater detailed discussion relevant for the mains examination, starting with in the science section, new study makes weather tweaking idea more realistic. Now, there is a detailed article which has appeared about the aspect of geoengineering and how it can be relevant. So, that is where we will conduct a kind of a critical analysis. Now, this is one of the favorite areas of UPSC when it comes to prelims as well as the mains examination. That is why it is very, very relevant as well. So, this is important for your GS paper 3. Then, judicial sensitivity to sentiments is a sign of regression. This is an editorial piece which has appeared in the editorial section, obviously, which talks about and explores the varying trend of that free speech regulation, which is which is something which is demarcated in clause 2 of Article 19. What is that and what is the trend that the article is postulating is something we are going to discuss. So, this is a part of your GS paper 2. Now, consultative regulation making that should go further. This is about the regulations which are being postulated by quasi legislative bodies like RBI, SEBI, and so on, and the need for having a kind of a consultation before going for a policy framework. This is something relevant again for your GS paper 3. Now, defense production in India receives a fillip. So, over the past few years, the defense production in India has been increasing. The impact of it is something which can be seen in terms of our defense exports. We will explore more about it when we talk about the article relevant again for GS paper 3. What is the significance of the census? The census has been announced to be conducted in 2027. Why is this census exercise very, very important? What are the important aspects associated? GS paper 2. How is India planning to localize EV manufacturing? So, the scheme for domestic manufacturing of electric vehicles, the details have emerged. Now, how is it that it can impact the manufacturing in a positive or a negative manner? GS paper 3. Now, after that, some of the articles relevant for your prelims. So, we have taken up the help of even one of the pictographical representation in page 1 that talks about the ban on bottom trawling. So, what is bottom trawling? Relevant for your prelims. Kumki elephants are in news. So, what are those kumkis? That is again something we are going to discuss. India and Mongolia, they are holding a joint military exercise. The name of the military exercise becomes relevant for your prelims. And a liver condition, a disease which is growing not only in terms of its prevalence but also prominence across the larger masses of us Indians, something that we need to be beware of. So that is again relevant for your prelims examination from the perspective of science and tech. So these are some of the articles that we are going to discuss today. Now, as you can see, all these articles represent a wide variety of discussion points from GS paper 2, 3, and so on. Now, many of these you will be able to understand better if you have some idea about the basic static content. Keeping that in mind, for all the aspirants who are going to appear for the examination in 2026 and 27, there is a need to bolster your foundational values and the foundational knowledge of the GS subject. So, for that, we have come up with a lucrative offer for all the foundational batches. Now, the classes have started, but then you can join this and you can use the code IS English to avail greater discount, and you can get access to test series, quality lectures by the top educators across various different subjects, and you can go for answer writing practice, live answer writing practice, mentorship guidelines, and so on. So do avail this offer and thereby increase your chances of success in the exam. Having said that, we come to the first article of the day relevant for your GS paper 3. The article talks about that how new study makes controversial weather tweaking idea more realistic. Now, what is this weather tweaking idea? What do we mean when we talk about weather tweaking? So, basically, this all forms a part of what is referred to as the concept of geoengineering, whereby this is seen as a kind of an instrument to fight against climate change and global warming. Now, we all know that owing to anthropogenic or human caused activities, the temperature across the world has been rising at an explosive pace. Now, as the temperature is rising, time and time again, we have had a discussion about the impact of that temperature rise. How this impacts or influences us humans, how does it impacts the biodiversity? Everywhere across the planet, we are witnessing the devastation caused due to temperature rise and due to climate change. Now, scientists for a long period of time have been toying with the ideas that somehow we can reduce this level of heating, the amount of heating which is happening across the planet. Somewhere or the other, we can provide some mechanism, some solutions by which we can reduce the level of heating. So, this artificial mechanism to deal with the rising temperature, to reduce the temperature across the planet, that is what is termed as geoengineering. Now, as a part of geoengineering, there are various different solutions that are provided by the scientists. From, for example, flooding the oceans with iron filings so that there is an increase in the plankton population. Why that is there? Talk about it. Or placing large mirrors in the space so that they can reflect the solar rays. So, if the mirrors reflect the solar rays, there will be lesser amount of heating received on the Earth's surface. Amongst one of these ideas is basically injection of sulfur aerosols or sulfate aerosols in the region of stratosphere. Because these sulfate aerosols being whitish in appearance, they will be reflecting the solar rays. And as they will reflect the solar rays, there will be lesser amount of solar rays coming onto the Earth. So that is the weather tweaking idea, which is termed to be controversial. Let us explore this in a broader perspective beyond what is written in the article in itself. So, here, first of all, what is geoengineering? The definition of it. What will you write when you have a direct question about what is geoengineering? So, geoengineering is a large scale intervention in the Earth's oceans, soil, and atmosphere with the aim of reducing the effects of climate change, generally in a temporary fashion. Obviously, as I told you, let's suppose placing large mirrors in the space. That can never be a permanent solution, can it? It can only be a temporary solution. Then, it's a false solution to the climate crisis that aims to address the symptoms of climate change. Now, this is for your understanding. This is not something that needs to be directly and crudely replicated in the answer paper, because we have to understand that anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, they are creating the greenhouse effect, or rather exaggerating the greenhouse effect, which is causing increased amount of warming. Unless and until we deal with those emissions, unless and until we reduce those amount of emissions, any kind of other measures that we take, that is simply a cosmetic bandage that we are putting over a wound without dealing with the wound itself. The wound will never heal. We shall or end up covering the wound, right? So this geoengineering is carried out by two broader criteria. There are two broader types of this geoengineering. One is the case of, when we talk about the types of geoengineering, I'll show you the various examples also. So, what is referred to as SRM, and second is CDR. SRM refers to solar radiation management. Radiation management. And the second one is what is CDR, that is carbon dioxide removal. These are the two methodologies. Now, this is supposed to create a level of cooling, or in other words, reduce the level of heat, the heating that we are experiencing on a day to day basis. Let's suppose, as I told you, on the ground surface, if you have excess amount of solar rays which are creating that heating effect. So, if I place mirrors in the space, obviously the solar rays won't reach the ground surface. So, that is one of the solutions of solar radiation management. Other aspect which the article talks about is injecting the region of stratosphere with sulfate aerosols or sulfur dioxide based aerosol. Now, sulfur dioxide based aerosols, they are whitish in appearance. And what do we mean by the term aerosol? For those of us who don't have a background of science or environment, what do we understand by the term aerosol? These are microscopic particles, either gaseous, liquid, or solid, mostly in liquid or solid state, which can remain suspended in the atmosphere for some duration of time. Those are aerosols. They generally have a substantial number of chemical compositions like carbon or sulfur combinations, which is something which lends them a reactive property in many of the cases. Now, these sulfate aerosols being brighter in appearance, they again act as reflection surface. So, thereby reducing the amount of solar rays. So, in any of these methodologies that you are seeing, you are reducing the solar radiation which is reaching the Earth's surface. So, you are in a way reducing the amount of heating. The other is carbon dioxide removal. So carbon dioxide we know is a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide, greater amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere creates greater amount of heating. So what if we remove that carbon dioxide? That is a process which is also referred to as carbon capture and storage or carbon sequestration. Now, how do you do that? Let's suppose you plant more trees. Now, trees carry out the process of photosynthesis. In the process of photosynthesis, they will take in carbon dioxide, release oxygen. So, carbon dioxide is removed from the air. Also, oceanic surfaces, they absorb humongous amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, within the oceans, you have the presence of planktons, the phytoplankton. Now, these phytoplanktons, being the microscopic algal species they also carry out the process of photosynthesis. So, they also take in the carbon dioxide, utilize it for the process of photosynthesis, and give out oxygen. So, but the phytoplanktons, they cannot grow anywhere and everywhere. They do need the presence of certain nutrients. Without the nutrients, they are incapacitated. So that is why the one of the solutions that the scientists they play with is filling the oceans, or rather spreading across the oceans, the presence of iron filings. What do we mean by iron filings? So when we say filings, basically small particles, right? Very, very small particles. Now, these filings, if you spread over a region, that provides nutrients for the growth of phytoplanktons, and more phytoplanktons mean greater absorption of carbon dioxide. Greater absorption of carbon dioxide means removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, hence providing a level of cooling. So, this is the broader principled classification of geoengineering methodologies. Now, here in this particular image and graphic, you will observe various different techniques which are mentioned, which come under the category of solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. Among the solar radiation management, reflective aerosols, cloud seeding can be done, space mirrors that can be held, and amongst the carbon dioxide removal, forestation, CO2 capture, direct carbon capture, CO2 capture from fossil fuels plus storage, ocean iron fertilization that can also be carried out. Mind you, from each of the points that you see here, UPSC has been repeating questions in the prelims examination in particular. So next time when you wonder where is UPSC picking up the questions of environment in the prelims, rather than running from door to nook and corner, just take a look at the basic current affairs and explore the world around it. you will get, and you will be able to predict the questions as well. Now, having said that, what is this stratospheric aerosol injection that the article talks about? As I mentioned already, that it is about injection of aerosols in the region of stratosphere. But then why is it something which is referred to as controversial? Because there are disadvantages associated with it as well. There are dangers associated with it as well. Something we will explore. Now, one of the factors that we have to keep in mind is when we talk about stratosphere, stratosphere is the second layer of the atmosphere from the surface. Below the stratosphere, you have the region of troposphere. Now, troposphere is not the one having uniform height, isn't it? Troposphere has varying height as compared from the region of the poles to the region of equator. At the region of equator, the tropospheric height can be as much as 16 to 18 kilometers. Obviously, there is a seasonal variation. During winter, slight lesser height, during summer, slight greater height. And around the region of the poles, around 8 to 9 kilometers. Now, this height variation, very briefly, if you have to understand, is aided because of certain factors. Polar regions are very cold. Colder areas mean the air will be heavy and will sink. So, automatically, the height becomes less. And in the equatorial region or the lower latitude, there is rising air because it is heated. Heated air is lighter. There is rising air. It tends to expand. So, this is one of the basic reasons. There are other minor reasons like centrifugal force, expansion, contraction, the convective current. There are multiple reasons, but this is the broader understanding of why troposphere has got varying height. So, this is the region of troposphere. Above the region of troposphere, you have the layer of stratosphere. Now, they are basically separated by a kind of a discontinuity, so to say, which is tropopause. Now, if you have to inject the sulfate aerosols, you inject it in the region of stratosphere. So, there, if let's suppose, where do you experience greater amount of heating across the planet in general? Across the polar region or across the lower latitude? Always across the equatorial region and lower latitude, the temperature keeps on increasing. Across the poles, yes, it slightly gets warmer, but still it is below freezing in most of the parts of the year. So here, when you have to inject those sulfate aerosols across the lower latitude, you have to climb up to a height of close to around 20 kilometers and then spray that. Now that requires specially designed aircrafts. That requires specially modified aircraft and aircraft structure to provide that stability. That is why something which has never been deemed to be possible, because it would involve the expenditure of billions of dollars out there. Whereas in the subpolar and the polar region, you can inject the aerosols at around 10-kilometer height, for which you do have airplanes already in existence. So it will not be that costly, right? So this sulfate aerosol injection, if it is done now at lower height, it can be done without much expenditure. But at greater height, you need specially designed planes, much costly. So that is where the effort has been to spray this in a larger area. That is what the studies have been carried out for. That how do we spray this over a larger area so that we reduce the amount of heating over a larger surface. Now, this sulfate aerosol, mind you, if you spray it over a region, let's suppose if you spray it at an altitude of 20 kilometers or 22 kilometers. Now, in stratosphere, you don't have that much wind movement. So the aerosols will stay there for some time and will carry out the reflection process of the solar rays for a longer duration. But if you spray them, let's suppose at a lower height, right? What happens then? The winds will carry it away, winds will blow it from one region to another. That will not be a long lasting solution. Now, generally, why do we and how have we come across this as a solution, by the way, that we will spray sulfate aerosol? Because of one of the natural phenomena and the experience from it. The natural phenomena that I'm talking about is the case of volcanic eruption. That is why this entire process is also referred to as mimicking a volcano. So, volcanic eruption, during a volcanic eruption, what tends to happen? You have so much amount of SO2 which emerges out of the volcanic eruption. Mind you, SO2 is not the most dominant gas out of a volcanic eruption. In a volcanic eruption, amongst the most dominant gases, water vapor or steam, followed by CO2, etc. But SO2 amount is very high. Now, this SO2 will combine with hydroxide molecules in the upper atmosphere and it forms SO2 based aerosols. Now, these SO2 based aerosols, they are brighter in appearance. Brighter in appearance. As a result, they have a reflective property. Reflective property. And hence, they will reduce the amount of solar rays. So, that is the case of the mimicking the volcanic eruption. That is the impact of volcanic eruption. That is why whenever you have a volcanic eruption, initially that region heats up. But over a longer duration of the months that follow the volcanic eruption, there is a cooling effect because the solar rays they are blocked. For example, in the 1880s, when you had the very violent Krakatau eruption in the western part of Indonesia, the amount of eruption and the amount of cloud sent high up were so massive that the solar rays in that particular island got blocked for almost 2 months. So that is the impact. Pinatubo eruption of 1991, again in the region of Philippines this time, that is again one of the most massive eruptions of the previous century. That created a kind of an aerosol cloud and a kind of a cloud shield, which again shielded the sun or in a way hid the sun for many weeks together. So this is what is referred to as mimicking a case of a volcanic eruption. But the problem with that is, where do you spray the aerosol? Lower level, temporary relief. Higher level, permanent relief, but higher level, costly. So that is why the scientists and the researchers in UK they have suggested basically why don't we spray it at lower level itself but we do it at polar and subpolar region. Obviously they are concerned about the heating of the region of Britain. Britain, the height of the troposphere is low. So they are happy with spraying it over the region of Britain so that Britain gets some amount of cooling effect. Now, what are the research findings? This is interesting to note. The research findings indicate that injecting 12 million tons of, mind the volume, 12 million tons of sulfur dioxide every year at an altitude of 13 kilometer would provide a cooling by zero point 0.6 degrees Celsius. In order to attain a cooling by 1 degree Celsius, the amount of sulfur dioxide which requires to be injected is a whopping 21 million tons. Now, think about it. The spray quantity of 12 million tons is that which was created by Mount Pinatubo. But again, this is something which is in the polar and subpolar latitude, not in lower latitude, whereby if the particles were injected at lower latitude at a greater height near the equator, the amount of sulfur dioxide to be injected would be lesser. But by now, in our discussion, you also would have gained an idea that this is not a kind of a permanent solution. That is why it is seen to be a kind of controversial move. So, what are the challenges if, let's suppose, you go for sulfate aerosol injection? First of all, it can lead to a damage in ozone layer also. Ozone layer which is present in the region of stratosphere that can also get impacted, isn't it? Sulfate after all becomes one of the key pollutant and catalyst in the reaction between CFC and the ozone which is there. Then it can be a base for creating acid rain. Let's suppose it is carried by the winds and it is brought to a lower level. Now, water molecules will combine with the sulfur dioxide to create a very mild but nonetheless sulfuric acid. Now, this sulfuric acid can be damaging on the skin, it can be damaging on the plants, it can create a kind of corrosion on the various different surfaces that we see. So, that is why. acid rain, it is major impact. Global impact will be observed of all these: acid rain, ozone layer damage. It is not as if I have simply sprayed it over the region of UK. My country, my city will be safe. Rest of the world, I don't care. Because when you spray it, the air doesn't have an international boundary. The atmosphere does not follow national jurisdictions. Winds, they tend to move, and thankfully so. And as a consequence, the pollutants also travel. And that is a risk which is simply too great. Now, it is not a solution to climate change, is it? It is just a temporary bandage that you are providing, unless and until we prevent the emission sources and the amount of emission. We are not looking at a long term solution out there. Now, it can create circumstances of dimming. What do we mean by that? Let's suppose the plants, or let's suppose the species in a region, they are exposed or they are used to certain amount of solar rays. They have modified their entire ecosystem and mechanism based upon those solar rays. Now, let's suppose that you have dimmed out or you have sprayed the aerosols and the amount of solar rays reaching the surface has reduced. Now, that will lower the amount of solar insolation, so create a condition of dimming. So that will impact photosynthesis, rate of photosynthesis, metabolic growth in plants. It will also impact the circadian rhythm of the various different species, endanger various different species. So just because we have started feeling uncomfortable and the various species are adapting doesn't mean that you push everyone on the verge of it in order to find a temporary solution. Had it been a permanent solution, still it could be a risk worth taking, but it is a temporary solution. That is why overall the concept of geoengineering in itself needs to be dealt with in an angle, in a direction whereby we need to weigh the advantages and the limitations simultaneously. The limitations are substantial. But before that, advantages. What are the advantages that this geoengineering provides? First of all, it can reduce the explosive rise in temperature that we are experiencing across the planet. In many regions of Europe, for example, the departure from the normal temperature is already around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, which is much higher than the estimated target of 1.5 degree or 2 degrees Celsius since the time of Industrial Revolution. So heat waves are becoming common in the region of Canada and Siberia. Thousands of species die every year due to the excessive heat waves. So maybe this temporary solution can save some of the species. So it can reduce the climate related loss to humans as well as biodiversity. When we say climate related losses to humans, we have to understand heating at the region of the poles. Now that impacts oceanic circulation. That can also create more explosive cyclones, more devastating storms. And as a consequence, we tend to lose large amount of lives, property everywhere across the planet owing to the climate induced disasters. So this can be a temporary solution for that. But at the same time, there are set of challenges. Now, one of the challenges that should be highlighted is where we refer to, or I call the portion of geoengineering as a billionaire solution. What do I mean by billionaire solution? So, all of us have problems that we deal with, but there are certain solutions which can be adopted or followed only by certain set of individuals. Now, geoengineering as a solution against climate change, can it be adopted by a country like India? No, we don't have the wherewithal to do that. Can it be adopted by any country in Africa which is impacted by climate change? No. At max, where it can be involved or where it can be provided as a solution is the global north, developed nations, and that too, the big billionaires which are there as a kind of a recreational activity. They can do that, they can experiment that. So it is not a permanent solution that you are seeking. There's a technological disparity amongst the nations. So, do those nations who don't have technological development, they don't deserve this kind of uh, respite against rising temperature? That is again an ethical question that the world must address before going for a one size fits all policy towards climate change. It is not implementable on a global scale, does not address the root cause of climate crisis, can have detrimental impact on the natural cycle of the species. And in simple one sentence, has not been implemented, cannot be implemented as per the present technology. So we are planning what can happen in the era around 2060, 2070. That diverts the focus away from the main problem, that the climate change is happening because of human factors and human conditions. Let's take a look at the question which can be framed from this particular topic. Now, what is geoengineering? Critically analyze its role in providing a solution to climate change. Now, this is a simple, straightforward question, can be expected in GS paper 3. What do you write in the intro? Simple definition of geoengineering: altering the mechanism of heat received in the region of the soil, the water, and the atmosphere to reduce the amount of heating by two processes: solar radiation modification and carbon dioxide reduction. This is your introduction. Then, in the body, elaborate a little bit because it is a 15 marker about the various examples. Provide certain examples of geo, then get into the analyze part. Now, generally in critically analyzed part, I would suggest to you, based upon the question and the topic that we have, first talk about the positives, what it can achieve. After you have mentioned about the positives, then mention, however, this initiative will or has got certain challenges that it has to overcome, or that is something that has to be kept in mind. Those challenges would be, and then list out the challenges, right? From ozone hole, take examples of ozone hole, take examples of what happens when you have excess iron fertilization, something that we have covered in the UCAN and the current affairs session as well, that it is making the oceans depleted of the other nutrients because of the bloom in the algal species of phytoplanktons. All those disadvantages and challenges you mentioned. What should be your conclusion in this kind of a question? Conclusion has to be a kind of a way forward because there's a problem which is being talked about. So when you are writing the conclusion, geoengineering or any of these methods can have limited success unless and until the root cause creating the climate crisis is addressed, and that is anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. So the urgency should be to put a cap on that and thereby formulate national and international policies in order to regulate. Only then can we have a long lasting solution against climate change. Like that, you end the answer. Okay? Now, after this, we come to the second article. Judicial sensitivity to sentiments is a sign of regression. This is written by one of the famous advocates of Supreme Court, Sanjay Hegde. Now, this is relevant for your GS paper too. Now, here, the article talks about and brings into reference the various different cases which have come to the doorsteps of higher judiciary in recent time, where freedom of speech and expression is being talked about. Now, the article argues that we are seeing very frequently the court talking about the fact that you have hurt the public sentiment. You have hurt the public sentiment, so you need to apologize, especially in the case of, and this article also mentions the case of the controversy with Kamal Hassan and the language row between Kannada and Tamil. So that is where the court also observed that basically you have hurt the sentiments of the masses. This is something you should not do. So apologize. Now, the entire context of the article is, and in the context in which the entire framing has been done, is that judiciary, the moment it starts having a kind of a subjectivity in what is hurting the public morality or not, it is in a way incentivizing public outcry. For example, if in a particular issue there is a large scale public outcry, then the article argues judiciary tends to take a safe stance that please don't speak anything about it. It is not a part of absolute free speech and expression. So that is what the argument of the article is, that when we talk about Article 19.1, which 1A, which talks about the freedom of speech and expression, there we should have a slight amount of freedom in order to express, and that should not be always judged upon where the public outcry is coming from. Thereby, we are shifting the compass into the realm of morality. And when it moves into the realm of morality, that is when it starts becoming dangerous. Here, a term is also used, that is the doctrine of chilling effect. What is that doctrine of chilling effect? Whereby, let's suppose you have said something and I have also repeated the same. But the police tomorrow, what they do, they arrest you, they incarcerate you, and you are facing a lot of trials, right? Appearances after appearance, denial of bail. So that is a kind of a hectic process that you have to go through. Now, seeing the fate that you have gone through just because of mentioning or uttering something, next time, even though the court, the judiciary, the police has not taken any action against me, but next time I shall automatically refrain from making any statement which can create the same kind of controversy. Doctrine of chilling effect, leading to self censorship. And self censorship is never that good. So that is what the article is about. So, very briefly, let us touch upon the important key points of the article and let us analyze why it is important for us to maintain the decorum of free speech. So, here, starting with the entire discussion around which this is revolving around, that is Article 19.1. Now, Article 19.1 has got various sub provisions. Out of them, one of the provision which is always contested and argued and riles up sentiments unlike anything else is Article 19.1a. That is the freedom of speech and expression. Now, what is that freedom of speech and expression? To what extent should we be allowed to speak? And am I allowed to speak anything and everything? In fact, when this was put into the constitution at that point of time itself, there was some amount of argument regarding putting certain limitations. Limitations were not brought about immediately. But the first Constitution Amendment Act brought in certain limitations to this free speech. That was owing to the fact that the government at that point of time, now the government had certain policies in certain states owing to the financial allocation. Now, there was a reportage across wide scale and large scale media houses, which the government did not like at that point. That is when it brought about certain amendments. The constitutional first constitutional amendment was brought about. And that is when you had certain limitations which were added. And clause 2. What is that clause 2? So nothing in subclause A of clause 1, that is a free speech and expression, now shall affect the operation of any existing law or prevent the state from making any law insofar as such law imposes reasonable restrictions on the exercise of the right conferred by the said subclause, whereby interests of the sovereignty and integrity of the country, security of the state, friendly relations with the foreign states, and then comes the important part: public order, decency, or morality, or in relation to the contempt of court, defamation, or incitement when offense. These are your reasonable restrictions. Now, when it comes to sovereignty, integrity of the country, when it comes to relations with the foreign nations, there everything is still very much in a wrap and it is limited. But when it comes to these parts, public order, decency, or morality, this is where the conundrum begins. If I say something, if I utter something today, now what impacts the morality? Who will justify the morality? Morality of today's times will be very different from what morality used to be. Let's suppose, or rather than using and fixating with the term morality itself, what is moral? You would have heard about moral values. Now, moral values in general, they keep on changing, they are not fixed. So, if they keep on changing, morality and the definition of morality keeps on changing, that brings about so much amount of indiscriminate subjectivity. That is where the present trend is leading to, where almost each and every offense against free speech is put down based upon that it has impacted the public morality. So that is what the article argues is something which indicates a kind of a regression. Now, the article basically, if you talk about the reference of it, the context of it, Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution protects even the provocative, offensive, or unsettling speech as a citizen's right. Now, however, judiciary is now more focused on protecting sentiments rather than upholding constitutional freedom. That is the argument of the author. Now, issues in upholding free speech, the trend which has been pointed out in the article. First of all, a trend of prioritizing emotional hurt over constitutional rights. Now, if I, as an individual, I am hurt, now what defines what is hurt, what is harm, right? It is all subjective based upon the public outcry which is created. Any speech must now pass a popularity test unless and until you have basically, unless and until a large mass of the population adheres and agrees with what you have said, it no longer constitutes a free speech, even in the eyes of judiciary. Then courts increasingly demand emotional reactions to be factored into legal decisions, and this includes whether the speech causes outrage or discomfort, whether it encourages bad opinions or defames institutions. Now, to some extent, we can agree to the fact that the courts and the judiciary has to be mindful of the public sentiments. After all, if that would not be the case, rather than having judges and such experienced individuals in the judiciary, just simply replace them with a kind of a computer, a mechanized result. So, judiciary has to be keeping in mind the public sentiments, and the public sentiments keep on changing. Accordingly, the judiciary has to modify itself. But then to what extent? Where does that threshold come in? And where does it start becoming very absurd and very superficial? That is the question. That is the important point that the article fixates upon. Now, there are certain disturbing trends which have emerged. I have summarized it in 2 points here: subjective emotional standard and moral policing of language. First of all, courts are deciding cases based on feelings rather than indeed have they caused damage to public decency, morality, or the public order. And secondly, moral policing. Profanity or vulgarity is now equated with criminality, ignoring the constitutional protection of even unpopular opinions. In fact, many of the, even if you put the older, many of the older movies or many of the older artists across the spectrum of jurisprudence that we have now, many of them would fail that judicial test. So that is where we are drawing the line in the sand. So then comes the doctrine of chilling effect. That is, in law, first time it was used was basically in the 1950s in US judiciary, and where in the judgment this term was utilized. Now, the doctrine of chilling effect is leading to self censorship, and we have empty number of cases, large number of cases where a certain particular artist or a certain particular individual, they have been harassed is not a correct term, but they have gone through a certain experience based upon what they have spoken, what they have written, that the others automatically choose the path of self censorship. That again is not what was dreamt of by the founders of the constitution and the creators of the constitution. Again, something argued in the article. So refers to the indirect discouragement or suppression of free speech and expression to the fear of legal or other negative consequences. So that is the case of doctrine of chilling effect. So what are the implications of all of these developments which are happening? Courts sometimes behave like moral adjudicators. What is moral? What is not moral? Judiciary is deciding that. And large number of high court, for example, if you simply take a look at some of the judgments in the past year issued by the Allahabad High Court, that again indicates and substantiates this disturbing fact. Then anything that provokes discomfort is now a threat, even if it holds no real risk to the actual population, encouraging apologies and deference over rational argument. That rationality has taken a back seat, or in fact has left the building, is something we can safely say. Incentivizing public outcry. Public outcry has become a kind of a tool nowadays. Now, on a particular issue, if the outcry is more, that issue becomes more prominent. So, in the next issue, unless and until, or if the top echelons are not paying heed, create more outcry. And this is a kind of a vicious cycle which is being observed disturbingly in many parts of the country. Now, free expression by artists, they take a hit, changing the threshold of what is harm and what is hurt. So, this puts objectivity aside and brings about a kind of a moral policing of sorts from the hands of judiciary. That is the argument of the article. So, in this article, overall, what is it that is being mentioned? What is the trend associated with Article 19? Right? What is Article 19.1, Article 19.2 subclause? That is something you have to understand. Then, why is this change happening? This change is happening owing to the changing public scenario where a large outcry can be created. Social media plays an important role. As a consequence, there is a divergence from the constitutional jurisprudence and what is actually happening. This is bringing about a doctrine of chilling effect where the freedom of speech and expression can also be impacted. Okay? Now, let us take a look at the practice question. What is the doctrine of chilling effect? Analyze it in the context of India. Now, this can be a kind of a question asked in GS paper 2. So, doctrine of chilling effect, I have provided the definition. You can use that directly in the intro. Intro should directly address that. And to all of you, I do request you, please do not get overtly emotional with any of these topics in paper 2 while writing the answer. If, let's suppose, we feel very strongly about a particular topic in any of the directions, towards, against, neutral, any of those directions, if we have very strong feeling. Yesterday, I had provided you the solution. Write your feelings in a piece of paper, wrap that paper, put it in the closet, lock the closet, and then come to the exam hall. In the exam hall, in the answer sheet, there is no scope for excessive polarizing comments to be put in the answer paper. Okay, please don't do that. So, in the intro, put the answer of direct definition of the doctrine of chilling effect. Then, in the body, when it is saying analyze it in the context of India, in the body, basically talk about certain instances. Case instances, you can provide the Kunal Kamra case, etc., the relevant, the contemporary cases that you can provide, even in the case of the recent controversy around India got latent that reached the doorsteps and the observations made by the Supreme Court. Now, you don't have to immediately quote it, but you can use it as a referential pointer. Then you talk about the points that we have mentioned here, that how it shifts the threshold, the courts start acting like the moral adjudicators, and public outcry becomes a norm, all those you mention. However, at the end of it, you do mention in the later part of the body itself, the judiciary's role is also to be flexible and to heed to the public sentiments, whereby those public sentiments become a kind of a guiding light for the future decisions. Now, in the conclusion, however, you talk about the future perspective that going ahead, we have to value the Article 19.1a as sacrosanct in order to ensure upholding of democratic values in a large, diverse country like India, where interpretation can be substantial and can be diverse. Article 19.1a provides us with the guardrail which allows us to stick to the democratic principle. With that, you can conclude the answer. Try to write this answer. In GS paper 2, it is framing of the answers, which provides you marks. So try to write it and then move ahead. Now, after this, we come to the third article. Now, the third article talks about consultative regulation making that should go further. Now, this follows up in the month of May. RBI came upon with a set of guidelines whereby it said that it plans to go ahead with greater transparency about what goes behind in the decision making. Now, what goes behind the scenes in terms of decision making? After all, when you hear about the fact that RBI has not changed the rates, the bank rates, Now, immediately there's a lot of outcry from some section of the society or the other that the demand of the economy should be lowering of the rates. If the rates are lowered, a large section of the society comes around that the demand of the time is to fix the rates, to increase the rates. Everybody is an economist in the present day and times. So, RBI, following the footsteps of SEBI, has said that we will put it out in the public domain as well. That why have we taken a particular kind of a decision? Now, this article talks about the fact that yes, that is a good practice which should be followed. And the article argues that we should go much deeper into this. And we should borrow from the ideas that is already in practice in the countries and jurisdictions like US, UK, where there is a legislative backing to such transparency. Now, as far as the transparency factor goes, absolutely yes, that should be the case. But one also has to keep in mind that the same jurisdictions of US, now there, despite all the transparencies and the Senate hearings that keep on happening, the Fed was at the wheel while the entire economy drove into the trenches of financial economic disaster in 2008. Despite the fact that you had such a large amount of loan crisis, the Fed kept on making decisions. The SEC kept on, that is the counterpart of SEBI that you have in India, you have SEC in US. They kept on making decisions, basically, again, driving the economy into doldrums, impacting the global economy. Now, that means what I'm trying to convey is just aping the West is not the solution. Whatever they are doing, just copying that is not the. But then we have to pick certain pointers which can work good for us. So, here, let us contextualize this article. Let us understand what the article talks about. So, here, in May, the Reserve Bank of India issued a policy framework to guide the process of publishing regulations, directions, and notifications. It follows the footsteps of SEBI. SEBI had done this in the month of February itself. RBI will conduct impact analysis and outline the regulatory intent and objective for any new or amended regulation. Periodic review of regulation has also been promised by both the regulators, that is SEBI and RBI, to ensure continued relevance. In simple terms, transparency. Whatever we are doing, why are we doing that? Okay, that is the simplest analysis. Now, SEBI introduced similar guidelines in the month of February. It will also follow the same impact analysis, regulatory intent and objective, why certain regulations have been brought about, and open public consultations for minimum 21 days before finalizing rules. Now, the article has basically brought about or substantiated the facts that when we talk about public consultation before policy making, that is very minimal. Especially in the case of RBI regulations, less than 2% of the various notifications and the regulations which have been brought about, they included public consultation. Public consultation has got a greater value associated because unless and until you go for public consultation, till that point of time, various stakeholders won't be able to put their grievances. And your ability to convince the stakeholders is very important and pivotal to how the economy drives forward. Because in the economic market, sentiment, always you will read about this public sentiment, public perception, even when you calculate the hard figures like PMI, for example, isn't it? Month of May, month of April, there also you count in the public sentiment. So that public sentiment always holds a very important role in terms of economic growth and development in any region. So, unless and until you go for that stakeholder public hearing of their stakeholders, you won't be able to garner that confidence. You won't be able to address those problems and provide solutions. So, that is why public hearing should be increased. That is the argument, and that is justified. Now, importance of transparency. Why should we bat or advocate for transparency to be provided in the? There are reasons for. First of all, intervention should be based on clear economic rationale. Now, if you are transparent, fair enough, everybody gets to understand what is the rationale behind your move. Otherwise, they are restricted to or they are limited to kind of conjectures or guesses And that is when misgivings come in. Regulatory statements should explain the market failure being addressed and show why intervention is necessary. For example, we have seen that RBI has cut the rates drastically this month. Now, this time it has issued some notification and justification, but that is not the case always. So that is why one should be able to understand what is the future in this particular market and why is it that we are taking this step now. So that is something which should be. So it provides rationale for decisions. And this is also something which follows the trend of global best practices. Across the globe, the good markets out there, where we can follow some of their tendencies, like the US, the UK market, they also follow that trans. Now, institutionalized practices like impact assessment and periodic reviews. What is the meaning of this? Let's suppose I have lowered the rates, right? As RBI, I have lowered the rate. Now, lowering of rates means what? Money supply will increase in the market. When money supply increases in the market, it can lead to the increase in demand. So that can, and if the supply side does not match with the demand increase, it can lead to a kind of a sudden inflation, and that is never good. Inflation, some amount of inflation is good, but sudden amount of, let's suppose to the extent of hyperinflation, that impacts the poor much greater, right? So when you have lowered the rates, what is its impact that you foresee in terms of inflation? That impact assessment should become a regular feature. Same is the case with SEBI. SEBI, let's suppose it has brought about certain trade practice regulations. What will be its impact? Will it impact retail investors to a certain extent or not? And if yes, why? So that is something which is important to be conveyed. Now, the more transparent you are, this becomes a part of the institutional DNA. And when we say institutional DNA, that means practices followed by RBI, practices followed by SEBI, they will always keep into account these particular matters. So that is why it is important to maintain that start of transparency. Now, what is the way forward? Greater public consultation, legislative backing in the form of laws. They should not only be restricted to voluntary actions by these regulatory bodies, but rather there should be a legislative or a law of the parliament which should mandate these organizations to become transparent in their behavior, rectify the limited institutional capacity that they have. So many of the institutions, they don't have that kind of public communication system of impact assessment. And so even that institutional limitation, the state limitation that we have, that has to be rectified. Only then this transparency and contextualizing of any changes, that will become a reality and a practice. Okay. Now, then, legislative backing means create a legislation. Defense production in India receives a fillip. Now, this is an article which talks about the fact that post Operation Sindoor, there has been a spike in the overall, let's suppose, the market performance of the defense manufacturers, the MSMEs, etc. But this follows a slight trend which we have been seeing for the past few years, which is a very productive trend, whereby the production of defense equipment from India, the export of defense equipment from India, that is on the rise. Now, for example, India's defense production in 23-24 touched a massive 1.3 lakh crores. Second time consecutive year where we have crossed 1 lakh crore. Now, mind you, this is a massive kind of boost. Now, those of you who have been following India's defense sector for some time, you would be aware of the fact that not so long time back in the past, you had the case where even the bullet casings that we have, even the mortar shells that we have, those would be imported. And that too, in the case of not only import, but emergency import in many of the only during emergency. Now, not only have we become self sufficient in these cases, we have started manufacturing Kevlars. We have started manufacturing specialized Kevlar based helmets, bulletproof helmets, which is not only being provided to our own forces, but is serving even for export market. And when we are saying export, yes, we are exporting BrahMos to Philippines, we are exporting the Pinaka rocket launchers to Armenia, but does not mean we are not exporting to the top militaries in the world. I hope you are aware that some of the MSMEs in India, they also export to the US military when it comes to the Kevlar mounting in the case of helmet. So Indian defense industry is coming of age. It is happening in a slow process, but is nonetheless a movement in the right direction. So, in this article, with the help of certain charts, that has been validated. If you observe this, basically, the total value of defense production and its rate of growth, you will observe that the total value of defense production in our country has been increasing almost consistently. And the rate of growth is almost a whopping 17.5%. Massive. Now, total value of defense exports and the rate of growth. So, there also you observe that the rate of growth is 12%. And the value of defense export, again, around 20,000 crores and more. So, Pinaka systems, BrahMos systems, these being few of them. Now, what is the importance of defense production and increase in defense production? First of all, strategic autonomy, right? You do need a kind of strategic autonomy whereby you are allowed to operate the equipments the way that you want. You are allowed to deploy the equipments the way that you want. Now, all of you would be aware that when you use, let's suppose, a US imported equipment, like a fighter plane, or let's suppose even when you talk about the howitzers that US is selling us, the Apaches. Now, there is a certain kind of limitation on when you can use it, where you can use it. It is not a kind of a free for all. Now, even when you want to modify it to Indian terrain and Indian system, you need to alter the source code. For that, the US organizations and the companies won't do it. There is no technology sharing. But when you use your own equipments, you can modify the heck out of it. So that is why that autonomy and that flexibility is very important. Something in Operation Sindoor, we observed that with the help of the Akash Tir system that the army had deployed, whereby the interconnectivity of the various different radar systems and the guns, the old primitive based guns that the army has, decades old, all of them were interwoven together to form a kind of a security net. Now that could be done only based upon your indigenous technology. You can import all the technology that you want from the world, but you won't be able to weave them based upon your customization. So that is why domestic production is a must. All the major militaries of the world, they do this domestic production. We cannot afford to be left behind. Now there's a lot of downstream and upstream technological gains. For example, all of you would have heard or read about the fact that one of the major impediments in our fighter plane development is the development of our own indigenous engine, something that is also termed as the Kaveri engine, right? Now in Kaveri engine, we are unable to create an engine indigenously which can provide at least 110 kilonewton of thrust. We don't have that engine. We don't have the capacity. It has been running for decades, and we are unable to, and the project is unable to see the light of the day. Now, one of the problems identified in that Kaveri engine is that the fan in the engine, for the inlet of air, you need a kind of a fan. Now, the fan in the engine, the kind of fabrication of the elements of the fan, we don't have the capability to do that. That requires a crystalline fabrication methodology, which is not available in India as of now. So think about it. Once you start developing that engine tech, you will also start developing your own metallurgical scope as well, improving the metallurgical technology in your country. Now, imagine the amount of benefits it will have. If you are able to gain that proficiency in metallurgical aspect, you will be able to gain proficiency not only in general aerodynamics, but even in shipbuilding. You can use that. You can even use that in new edge cutting edge technology of automobile manufacturing. So the broader implications are massive, right? So, for example, in aircraft technology, you have the use of what is referred to as fly by wire, where you simply turn, and based upon the angle of turn, The computer automatically calculates the degree that you are trying to turn and redirects the various different vanes of the plane to give that turn. Now, that fly by wire technology from the aircraft industry has migrated into the automobile sector. So there is a lot of downstream impact and effect overall. So overall, your manufacturing prowess will improve. It will also end up creating high value jobs. High skilled jobs will be created in the market, fosters greater spirit of research, not only in the academia, but also in the organizations. It also, export will give you a lot of value, a lot of money, but at the same time, it will save foreign exchange because we are amongst the largest importers of arms across the world. And that drains a lot of foreign exchange. So that is something which can be seen. Now, even the MSMEs, when we talk about the MSMEs, they become very important. Recently, we had talked about how to improve Indo Australian relations, defense relations. There, we had talked about the importance of deal between the MSMEs. Now, it is the MSMEs which have indicated that the target set by the defense ministry and what they have achieved, they are the ones which create more number of jobs. And the share of private defense companies, that is on. So only then will a perfect ecosystem of industrial complex be created where manufacturing is incentivized, and that becomes a kind of a luxury for the Indian armed forces who have been languishing in a piecemeal allocation of budget, and who have been languishing with inferior equipments and fighting with slight inferior equipments in all the various different conflicts. If we want to gain that edge, it will not happen tomorrow. It will not happen in one decade. It is something which will take at least 2 to 3 decades. But then we need to start moving now if we want to achieve that at some time in the future. Now, after that, coming on to the next article. What is the significance of the census? Now, the census exercise has been announced. It will take place on March 1, 2027. Now, census is what? Enumeration of the population, counting the number of people that you have. That is your census exercise. Now, census exercise has always been carried out, right? Or simply put, counting the population has always been carried out. The article argues since the time of Chanakya till the time of even the Mughal emperor, where in Ain-e-Akbari, it has been mentioned that population count is important for formulation of policies for the public. So it is important, but a synchronized count of population, that at the same time you count the entire population so that there is no doubling, etc., which tends to happen. So that synchronized count is something which was brought by the British India. It was brought basically in 1881 during the British Raj, and you had W.C. Plowden who initiated this exercise. Now, after this, it had been carried out every 10 years since 1881 on. Now, caste, etc., would also be asked initially. Now, after that, it was not asked for a long period of time. Now, 2027 is when the government has announced it will carry out a detailed caste census. Now, before coming to the importance and relevance of this 2027 census, the exercise of census in it. What is that census exercise? And who carries it out? So basically, the power of the census or carrying out the census is given to the union government because it is in the union list. And it is the Census Act of 1948 that is the legislation governing the census. Now, it authorizes the central government to undertake the operations and appoint census commissioner to supervise the entire exercise. The center also appoints directors of census operations to supervise the census within several states, while the state governments, they become the executors of this particular exercise. Okay, so while the state governments may appoint census officers, right? Now, the staff for conducting the census is provided by the local authorities of a state, which is mostly the teachers deployed by the state government. Now, when we talk about the phases of census, historically, how the census has been carried out, if we take a look into 2011 census as well, it was carried out in two phases. First phase would basically be house list, whereby what would be done is the habitations, the houses, they would be visited by the census officials, and questions would be asked regarding the facilities that you have in the houses, whether you have what is the source of drinking water, right? Whether you have a working toilet, those details, what are the assets that you have, the vehicular movement, etc., flooring, all those details about housing, that would be done. Then in the second phase, you basically would have the enumeration, population enumeration, where the size of the population, etc., that would be brought into understanding. So after this entire compilation, would the results be declared that this would be the total amount of population in a particular region. But again, it would take at least a couple of years to come across an analysis of the linguistic groups, come across the analysis of various different aspects of sex ratio, etc. Everything, literacy rate in particular subsection, that would take some time, around 1 or 2 years. In last census, it was released by 2013. Now, every 10 years, the census exercise has been carried out. By the way, and another interesting trivia associated, every 10 years since 1881, India has indicated an increase in population, barring one decade, which is that decade where India experienced a dip in population. Think about it and let me know in the comment section. There was a decade when India experienced a dip in the population, otherwise, it has experienced an increase. Now, in 2021, when the census was slated to happen, we were suffering from COVID pandemic. So that is why census exercise could not be carried out in the regular time. After that, it had been delayed owing to the general elections, but still, you had a lot of scope for it to be conducted early. But now that it is being conducted in 2027, it becomes important and it becomes relevant for certain factors. Why? First of all, this becomes important basically for the first time. You have a kind of a caste census which is being carried out. Now, caste, asking someone's caste and detailing about it, that can be a sensitive topic. So, framing of the questions need to be very, very careful. So, for that, if time is taken, time should be allocated. But this is a very sensitive matter which is being handled for the first time. Then, after that, it is the first census which will be held post 2026. And that is when delimitation, issue of delimitation will kick in. Now, when we talk about issue of delimitation, it is subjected to the first census after 2026. So that can possibly alter the number of seats which go into polling for 2029 general election. So there are a lot of misgivings, lot of grievances, lot of reservations amongst various different states. So a careful handling needs to be done rather than simply brushing it all off as irrelevant demands. Then, this is also the census which will put into practice the aspect of women's reservation. I hope you recall the women's reservation which was passed. Now, that also comes into question and implementation. So that is why this census is going to be an important exercise, right? So thereby there has to be a handling with greater care and greater sensitivity. Okay, so in this particular census exercise, we will get an idea, and it is not as if we don't have a rough idea of population. But when an official census is conducted, you get an idea about the income inequality in much greater detail, the health condition in much greater detail, the sex ratio in much greater detail, the condition of child sex ratio in much greater detail, the literacy rate. So you get an idea about the progress that or the kind of detrimental impact of governance and lack of governance in certain regions, or the progress due to positive governance in certain region, right? So that is some of the benefits of carrying out the detailed census. Now, coming to the next article, how is India planning to localize EV manufacturing? So basically, the Ministry of Heavy Industries has notified the guidelines for the scheme to promote manufacturing electric cars and passenger vehicles in India. Now, as per the guidelines, many of them have touted these guidelines as the Tesla guideline, because many part of these guidelines, they aim at reducing the tax burden that the imported cars have. So earlier, when you had a completely built unit of, let's suppose, an electric vehicle which would be imported into the country, thereby you would have a customs duty of close to around 70% to 100%, which would be charged. Now, as per the new scheme, this has been lowered to around 15% for all vehicles valued under 35,000, right? So that would be lowered to 15%. Now, it makes many people happy that you will have Teslas coming into India. Barely do they realize that Teslas won't be coming at a price point of a Tata Nano or a kind of a Maruti Suzuki Alto. It would still be at a higher price point when it comes to the commercial vehicle or the passenger vehicle segment. Having said that, there is also a conditionality that these kind of companies who simply send the completely built units, they also have to promote domestic manufacturing. So they have to invest close to around, so they require an investment of close to around rupees 4,150 crores over 3 years. Over 3 years. Okay. That is the investment that would be required. And also, the manufacturing, they have to promote the manufacturing in such a way that basically enable 25% of the overall manufacturing taking place in India within the next couple of years, and slowly raising the amount of that bar to 50% of being manufactured domestically. So these are the new regulations which have been brought up. But when we talk about EV manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing in India, there are certain issues that we face. First of all, the basic issue is lack of tech. Lack of tech. Now, you see, these guidelines that we have talked about, they have been formulated to attract the foreign vendors to India, so that these foreign vendors, when they will start manufacturing in India, the hope is they will transfer technology. But in today's day and age, nobody will transfer their technology to India or to any other country for that matter. They have spent a considerable amount of money developing that R&D. They will not simply transfer that technology because you are a good individual, right? So then examples of China and South Korea is cited. Now, China today alone accounts for 70% of the manufacturing of electric vehicles in the world alone. So think about it. Now, China has not reached that position by transferring technology from Teslas of the world. China has built its own. For example, the BYD is one of the largest EV manufacturers of the world. So there exists a gap in terms of what is the research skill, etc., required, and what do we have in India. Only when our own research and skill level tends to increase will the foreign companies be interested to collaborate with us. Otherwise, they will simply start a kind of a showroom model where they will set up their showrooms, they will sell their cars, and they will be happy setting up their plants in their home base. So that is where lack of tech, lack of research, lack of research There are tax incentives, etc., which are being provided, but then you don't have enough infra. For example, charging infra is not there, which is very common. If you ask the normal population about why don't they take in electric vehicles today, one reason they will tell you it is costlier. Second reason, they don't trust the electric vehicles. So that is where charging points need to be there, infra. And for this, you need industry, academia connect, academia connect. Unless and until that is not the case, you can never gain proficiency. Now, certain organizations, companies like Tata Motors, they have raised objections to the new scheme. They are saying that this will impact us, right? So the government should protect us in the initial year. But there again, we have to understand that till we have the policy where we keep on protecting our automakers from the foreign competition, we have to understand that our technological advancement will always lag behind. Something that we saw in the case of the steel industry, where till now the steel makers, they demand a certain set of protection. Now, that is where the Chinese technology has gone ahead, has zoomed ahead. Same is the case with electric vehicles. Now, when we talk about the Tatas, when we talk about the Marutis of the world, they have been very late ingressing into the market of EV. And even now, the technological advancement is quite limited. They are not investing so much in battery tech. They need to do that if they want to gain a competitive edge. So, these changes, which will allow the foreign vehicles to come in, that should be seen as just another aspect which can allow investment into manufacturing. But then that is not the only aim of the EV industry. Bolstering competition also brings about a competition for technology, which is where Indian companies have to material. Okay. Now, then certain articles relevant for the prelims. Now, one is the case of bottom trawling. What is bottom trawling by? Bottom trawling has been banned almost everywhere across the world, but it is still carried out as an unsustainable fishing practice in countries and in the coastal areas of India, particularly Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Now, bottom trawling is a practice where you cast a large trawl or net, and that is attached to a boat. And as the boat tends to move, or as the rotor tends to pull the net simply rubs against the sea floor and catches everything which is there on the sea floor. So, in this particular way, what it also does, it is aiming to gain maximum fish catch, but in the process, it is muddying the ocean water. It is uprooting the corals, causing coral bleaching. It is leading to a kind of a bycatch. Many of the fishes you don't want to catch. You don't want to catch a starfish out there. You don't want to catch many of those kind of species. You are catching them, right? And killing many of them, sharks being one of them. So that is why the ocean habitat and biodiversity is impacted massively owing to bottom trawling. So, bottom trawling as a practice is a reason why there are grievances, even on the side of basically when we talk about the Sri Lankan fishermen. The Sri Lankan fishermen also have this grievance against bottom trawling. So, that is where we have to know what is bottom trawling and what is its impact. Okay. Now, then, first operation of Kumki elephants to curb wild tusker menace in Andhra Pradesh to start soon. Now, what are these Kumki elephants? Kumki elephants basically are those trained elephants where they end up being the guide to the wild elephant herds that you see in the wild. Many of the times, you have the wild elephants going on a rampage. Now, you kill them, you euthanize them, or you tranquilize them. But these are too harsh a measure. As a human, what is the intervention that you can bring about? Very limited. Or let's suppose out there in the wild, there is one of the elephant which is grievously injured. Now, how do you bring the herd near to treatment? That is why you have certain trained elephants who are known as kumkis. Now, these kumkis, they allow for that training and they are trained in that particular region. They are left into that herd and they accordingly guide the herd away from the crops. They guide the herd away from human habitations. And that is what for that is for human benefit. So very briefly, what are kumkis? They are elephants trained to capture and tame the wild elephant. Elephant calves that are separated from the herd in the forest and captured wild elephants, they are tamed and they become the kumkis. In the region of Karnataka is where you have a lot of these kumkis, the practice of having kumkis. Training period is 3 years. Okay, so that is a comprehensive training period. And kumki comes from the Persian word kumak, which means aid, and is used all over India in the elephant belt and in the elephant corridor. They help in patrolling and rescue operation, for example, when any wild elephant gets impacted. Overall, again, in India, you have the Asiatic elephants, IUCN status endangered, sites, Appendix 1, and as per the Wildlife Protection Act, again in Schedule 1, meaning maximum protection. Then India and Mongolia, they hold joint military exercise against counter-terrorism, and they have been holding this exercise in the region of Ulaanbaatar in order to combat against a semi-urban setting and some amount of mountainous settings as well, in order to trade the and exchange best practices when it comes to counter-terrorism. For your prelims, what you need to know is what is the name of the with each of the country. I hope you are holding a repository of what is the name of the exercise. So the exercise name is nomadic elephant. Nomadic elephant. Okay, that is the exercise which is being conducted. Right now, then we come to the last topic of the day, and that is about MASLD, a liver condition which is in increasing spate in our country. So, what is MASLD? So, MASLD basically is also formerly it would be known as the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or NAFLD. Now it is referred to as metabolic dysfunction associated steatotic liver disease or MAS. So, what is this about? So, due to certain dietary conditions, due to certain lifestyle diseases or lifestyle practices, whereby like lack of exercise, etc., obesity, where the BMI, the body mass index, is high, in those cases, the liver starts developing pigments of fat. And that is when you have the case of the fatty liver. Now, immediately, it is not very dangerous. It is a reversible process. Let's suppose you are diabetic or increased BMI means the weight is very high as compared to your height, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. In any of these cases, these pigmentation can develop. But if let's suppose you have a strict regulation of your diet, you go for regular exercises, this can be reversed. But slowly and steadily over a period of time, it leads to fibrosis, where parts of your liver start becoming dysfunctional, and then eventually can lead to cirrhosis and even cancer. So that is the case of that lifestyle disease which India is battling with silently. So there needs to be a greater awareness about the type of diet and the lifestyle which requires to be. So for your examination, what is MASLD, why it is caused, and what are its outcomes? That is yes. Now, that limits or that brings us to the end of the discussion that we had today. I hope the discussion was helpful, fruitful, and you have added value to your existing knowledge amount. PDF will be available on the Telegram group in a few moments. If you like the content, put that in the comment section below. And don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.